Okay, everyone, I might get things started with your permission. For the rest of you, don't send me another lecture before this, do you?
Yeah.
Oh, God. Anyway, we'll get there eventually. I have a lot to get through with you guys today, but as I said, if we run out of time or energy or enthusiasm, I'll always record the last few slides and just put them up separately for you, so that won't be a big problem for you, shall we say. So, do you reckon there'll be more coming in dribs and drabs? And life is so annoying, but anyway, maybe. Yeah. It wasn't so bad when I was a student. Like the worst you'd have was like from, let's say, 322 in food science a year. Whereas the Western Gateway building back in my lifetime was a dog track. Some of you may remember if you're from Cork. That's where it was. Shall we say, students have got a lot fitter since I was undergraduate anyway. So. How are you getting on, guys? Any thoughts, comments? Are you finding your fourth year so far? Or your masters? Tiring. You're not used to being on campus, I'd say. Can't be with the days when you might be able to engage with a lecture from the comfort of your own couch. Deliver a lecture from the comfort of your own couch, which happened to me for a couple of years as well. So, yeah, that's very different, but I think I think there's a lot better buzz on campus now than there was, and so I'm delighted to see you all coming along. So I'll start off gently and slowly, and hopefully the others will be able to catch up as I actually have a fair bit to get through on this one. Where we're talking about basically, you might remember where we were the last time. I kind of skipped over acidification and Jervis Gerald. Sorry for confusion last week, I'm totally confused. He's actually joining you next week. He'll do starters. And just always remember the acidification, whereas I have it as a little box up on top there. The reality is it continues throughout the day, right the way down through the day of manufacture, until the salt and moisture content at salting obviously increases up to inappropriately. So basically what we look at today is going to be mainly in around Syneresis, how you control Syneresis, hugely important for the point of view of the cheese industry because it controls the moisture. Okay? So I'm on section 12 there, guys, if you want to look at the slides on that particular one. So look at dehydration. As I said, Syneresis is it's a key operation in all cheeses to a lesser or greater extent for controlling the moisture content. Okay? So what do you do? Well, if you leave a rennet gel standing and do nothing, then to be honest with you, it's reasonably stable. But if you cut the gel, if you stir the gel, if you heat it up, if you allow the pH to come down, all those things will encourage Syneresis. And that word, remember, the best way to think of it is think of it like a sponge. The gel is really kind of a sponge. A lot of water trapped inside, it shrinks down on itself, squeezing out the water that's trapped inside. And I'm not big into ancient Greek, but it comes from the Greek word meaning kind of gathering together. It's probably the best kind of one idea. So the importance of Syneresis, as I have on the slide there, is basically it allows you to control the moisture content of the cheese. And if there's one thing you really need to get right in cheese, it's moisture. There's another thing you really need to get right, it's pH and maybe salt. You get those things, you hit those three targets, there's a very good chance you're going to be pretty good in terms of the quality of the cheese. So obviously the extent of Syneresis depends on the variety. Some cheeses you want a lot of moisture gone. Other cheeses, like the high moisture cheeses there, you actually want to retain a relatively large amount of water within the gel. So in those cases, the gel isn't really cut. It's kind of scooped into molds, and a nice example of that is camembert. Camembert manufacturing, I'll give a slide on that coming up at some stage over the next hour or so. Lower moisture cheeses, you cut the curd, you stir it, you heat it up to encourage, all of these things will encourage Syneresis. And obviously the size of the cut is important, because the curd piece, the more surface area you have, the more there's easier for whey to be lost from the surface area. So a fine cut will give you more surface area, so you get better whey loss, and therefore lower moisture eventually in the cheese. Okay. So looking at a little bit of the technology, just some pictures there of cutting equipment. Obviously, these would be traditional ones. I have a picture of an off coming up in a little while. In like Dave, when he's over in the pilot plant there, would use horizontal and vertical knives. So vertical ones first and then horizontal, A and B up on top there. It's not clear at all from those sketches there, but A and B, the actual, they're kind of like, maybe they're about a bar, maybe about a centimetre wide. Okay, so what should I say? They're very thin, obviously, in this dimension, but if you look at them in going back and forward in that way, they might be about 1 centimetre in diameter. So C might look like very similar, obviously, in that particular shape. That's a cheese heart. The difference there is instead of having kind of knives or bars going down there, you actually have wires, and you just pull the heart through the gel to break it up to do it. That would be an old-fashioned way for doing it. D on that little diagram there is an implement called a spino. It's used for some hard Italian cheeses. The best way to describe it. It's almost like a wire basket, and you kind of punch the gel to break it up. I've actually got a picture of one coming up there. That's one I took in Sardinia there a few years back in the University of Sardinia. Again, the idea with that implement, you just kind of punch the gel with that implement to break it up. In the cheddar industry, though, you're obviously going to have cutting and stirring in the same vat. Okay. The idea there is, again, these OST vats. I would have gone through these with you before. You have a series of bars on a central axle on the frames, and those bars have a triangular cross section. So basically, when the pointy end is going in this direction, it's cutting the gel. You cut it by rotating it in, for example, this direction. You get a cut. Then, when you cut it sufficiently, you change the direction of rotation of the axle, and then the blunt end of the triangle then can be used to stir. So the same frame can be used for cutting and stirring. Obviously, you don't want to keep cutting the curd because eventually you'll just get kind of soup or something. But you need to keep at least the size of the curd particles there. Okay, so just from a scientific perspective, Syneresis is a notoriously difficult thing to study very, very precisely. It's a lovely example of what we in the trade would call an empirical test. What that means basically is that the actual measurements that you get, the number that you get, is very heavily determined by how you do the test. So, for example, a very obvious measure of Syneresis would be the volume of whey, but that depends on how you cut the curd, how quickly you stir it, what temperature it's at. So you need to define all of those parameters. So it's actually not an easy thing to study. The most common indication would be volume of whey expressed from a gel under very defined conditions. But there's other ones as well, like the amount of curd, the moisture content of the curd, various tracer marker methods, and so on. A lot of the studies actually in the literature will try to mimic the cheese making protocol. So they'll add in a starter, for example. They don't really need it in the lab, but it will mimic what's happening, and they'll cook as well to kind of mimic what's happening in cheese. So it's quite a difficult thing to study from a very precise way. But to be honest with you, the big picture I'm going to give you on the next slide is pretty accurate. Okay, so when does Syneresis happen? In lower moisture cheeses, dehydration is principally in the cheese vat. That's a pre-press vat for a Gouda type cheese. I took that picture, I think in the Czech Republic a few years back. What's happening there is the curdswhey mixture coming in from the big pipe, coming in on top. It's not very clear from the picture, but the side walls of that vat have perforations. So the whey is going through and the curds are being trapped underneath. But Syneresis and dehydration in Swiss type cheese, Gouda, cheddar, pretty much most hard or semi-hard cheeses will happen in the vat. Okay, so you get a lot of Syneresis. So basically, the separation of the curds and whey is kind of happens almost before it goes into the pre-press vat there. Little different situation happens in case of high moisture cheeses. High moisture varieties like Camembert, for example, might be a nice example. One there, that's the white mold cheese Camembert. What happens there is the molds are basically pieces of pipe with perforations, holes on the side. The gel is basically plopped into the pipe. It's filled up with the gel. And over time, then whey drains out through the holes on the side, through syneresis, and you're left then with a wheel of cheese of the same diameter as the molds that you have there on the left. So it's a cylindrical wheel of cheese at the bottom of the mold. In that case, there's obviously no cooking. The main driving force for syneresis is acid development. And actually, as you'll see, probably in the right-wing section, the pH at which you separate the curds and the whey in Camembert is much lower than other cheeses, and that is you actually get more retention of chymosin. So that's molds for soft cheeses. I can't remember where I got that picture. I'm pretty sure I took it myself, but I can't remember where it was. But basically, you see, you get the general idea. So the gel goes in. But in these soft cheeses, you want to retain quite a lot of moisture. So that's an important, so you're not trying to have very extensive syneresis. So what factors affect syneresis? You can kind of, I suppose, divide them into two categories: factors associated with the milk, and then ones that are under the direct control of the cheesemaker. So if we look at the effect of milk composition of syneresis, a lot on this slide, but hopefully it's straightforward enough. Square brackets for me always mean concentration. So if you have a high fat concentration, you have poor syneresis. The reason for that is fairly obvious, in that fat globules act as basically obstacles for the whey when it's trying to get out. So when it comes to a fat globule, the whey has to go around the fat globule. So that's to really impede whey loss. So the more fat that you have, the poorer will be syneresis. So if you increase the fat, it increases cheese yield by 1.2 times the mass of the additional fat. And that extra 0.2 there actually comes from the extra water that you're retaining within the cheese. So you get higher yields. The cheese will have higher moisture, though, obviously, as well. Casein concentration, the more casein concentration, the better is the syneresis. You might remember the last time I was talking to you, I showed you a picture of basically 4 small boxes, as I remember. One of them, it was just, the reason I put it up there was to make the point that syneresis is really the last stage of the renal coagulation process. Okay, so it's a natural process going right the way through renal coagulation and then allowing the gel to come together. So the more gel-forming protein you have, the more casein, the better is the syneresis. pH. The lower the pH of the milk, the better the syneresis. Probably mainly due to a charge effect. As you bring the pH closer to the isoelectric point of the caseins, the charge in the caseins goes down. And remember, when in syneresis, the protein strands have to come together. So if they're less charged, it'll be easier for them to come together. Okay. Calcium ions certainly necessary for syneresis. Definitely necessary there. Salt added to the milk, no, that's very rarely done. There's only a handful of varieties where you actually add salt to the milk. Nearly all cheeses are salted at the end. You add them to the curds, but actually adding it to the milk before cheese making. There's only 1 or 2 examples of that. The most common one in my mind is the Egyptian cheese Damiati. And basically, low salt concentration in the milk will help syneresis. High salt concentration will disimprove syneresis. It's probably related to something that you might have learned a long time ago in second year, and that's the salting in and salting out effects for proteins. Remember that? Remember that salting in, salting out effects of proteins. Okay, so they're kind of related to the milk. The rest of my slides really are looking at processing variables effect on syneresis. And there's lots of them there. These are kind of more under the direct control of the cheesemaker. Now, I suppose fat content of the milk is under control as well. But Type of rennet, not a huge effect. Size of curd particles is very large. Cooking temperature, pH. Stirring during cooking. Then dry stirring. What that means actually is after you drain the whey, you stir the curds at the bottom of the vat. Extent of cheddaring, pressing, and salting, and so on. All of those have fairly significant effects on syneresis, and my memory of my own notes is right. I think I pretty much cover those all on the next maybe half dozen or so slides. So we look at those first of all. Size of curd particles, the cut size. Basically, the smaller the pieces are, the more surface area you have, so it's easier for whey to be lost. Remember, whey is lost from the surface area or from the surface of the curd particles. So the smaller the cut size, the better. High moisture cheeses, as I said, you don't want much syneresis there. In that case, you don't really cut the curd at all. It's just scooped into a mold. So the smaller the curd, the finer the cut, the better is your syneresis. Next one there is rate of acidification, or pH. Basically, it's just shown schematically in that diagram there. The lower the pH, the better is the syneresis. This is just a schematic diagram, obviously, but it's just showing volume of whey expressed from time after cutting. And at the lower pH, you get more syneresis, more whey coming out as a measure of syneresis. Okay. Next one is the interesting one, is cooking temperature. So you cook the curd, sometimes it's called scalding the curd, but certainly cooking is probably better. I mean, for cheddar cheese, you'd be cooking it up at maybe 38.5 degrees, so it's not terribly, it's only a smidgen higher than blood temperature, so it's not very high temperatures by any means. Cooking temperatures vary from cheese to cheese. Cheddar, as I said, 38, 39 degrees. Gouda and Edam, 36 degrees. And that reminds me, by the way, that, again, my apologies for dismissing the entire world of non-cheddar varieties as just non-cheddar varieties. But it would be appropriate now, I think, for you guys to look at those recordings that I've made for you on non-cheddar varieties up on Canvas. Make sure you've looked at those before I come back, because I'll be doing a lot more on the varieties other than cheddar when we look at the whitening properties of cheese. So it's a good idea to have a look at those. I'll put into mine is Gouda and Edam, or Dutch type cheeses. They're cooked, by the way, in an unusual way, that they remove about 1/3 of the whey and replace it by hot water. And the pictures that and everything on this recording, so have a look at those in your own time. Camembert high moisture cheese is effectively not cooked at all. Okay. So, on the other hand, some cheeses, Emmental, Swiss type cheese, some of the hard Italian grana cheeses like Parmigiano Reggiano, they're cooked up at quite high temperatures, 54, 55 degrees. And that, they also have, particularly Parmigiano Reggiano, is quite a low moisture, maybe 30% moisture. So, a couple of obvious points there. The cooking temperature needs to match the starter. That's why I'm a little precise about the cooking temperature for cheddar cheese. To be honest with you, cheese making protocols are quite variable, so I'm often kind of about. But for cheddar cheese, I'm going to be a little bit more precise. I'd recommend cooking cheddar cheese not above about 38.5 degrees. And the reason for that is that a lot of mesophilic starter strains are killed at about 40 degrees. So even 1 or 2 degrees higher than that, you begin to kill off the starter. And that's obviously not particularly good for cheese making. Okay? Now, acid production by mesophilic starters like Lactococcus are slowed above 35 degrees, and they'll begin to be killed off above 40 degrees. Conversely, cheeses with a high cooking temperature generally use thermophilic starters. Ger will do all this with you starting next week. Thermophilic starters, you have a combination of Streptococcus thermophilus and Lactobacillus. The base of cheese is most commonly Lactobacillus delphocii subspecies lactis, the old Lactobacillus lactis. Anyway, they're thermophilic starters. They're quite temperature tolerant, as you imagine, thermophilic, they like heat. They don't tend to grow much above about 52 degrees. So the cooking temperature of Swiss cheese is up at about 55 degrees. So what happens actually is that in Swiss cheese, and again, look at the video, what you do is you basically make the gel, You cook the curds, cook the curdswhey mixture up to about 55 degrees, but there's actually very little acid has been produced at that stage. So you pitch the curds and the whey into a mould, the whey drains out, you're retaining the curd, and then as the curd cools down a little bit, then the starter produces acid. So most acid is produced actually after moulding in Swiss type cheese. As I said, the Syneresis in the case of Swiss type cheese is mainly driven by temperature in that sort of a case. How you actually cook the curds, nearly always it's by a jacketed vat, where you have an inner and outer skin of the vat, and you have a heating medium between the inner and outer vat skin. Heating medium is usually steam, sometimes hot water, but usually steam. The exception to that is Dutch type cheeses, where, like Edam and Gouda, where the target temperature might be around 36 degrees, but the way they cook that is by basically removing about 1/3 of the whey and replacing it by hot water. And as you see on the video as well, that curd washing step will also wash out some of the lactose from the curd, and it gives you a slightly higher pH at the end, and a cleaner flavour as well. So the last point there is on a thing called case hardening, and that refers to a problem that can happen if you cook the curds too quickly. Right? Okay, so usually what happens is after cutting the curds, and by the way, you would initially cut the curds, you might leave them stand for a little while, it's called healing time, for a couple of minutes, and then you very, very gradually begin to increase the temperature. And it's important that you increase the temperature very gradually for the first couple of degrees, and then you can speed up. If you heat the curd pieces too quickly, you get this problem called case hardening. What happens there is that the curd piece, basically you get excessive whey loss from the surface. So you get a kind of a dehydrated protein skin, for all the world, around the curd piece, and that traps the whey inside. So you have a dehydrated protein layer trapping the whey inside, so it can't get out. So conversely, if you may seem a bit counterintuitive, but if you cook too quickly in the early stages, you'll end up with a high moisture cheese, because the whey can't escape. Okay. That's pretty much, I've said all that before, haven't I? I left that slide in. Because just, again, just making, I think it's pretty much all the same. Other factors that affect Syneresis is stirring the curdswhey mixture. How quickly is the curdswhey mixture stirred? Stirring helps cooking, or helps Syneresis in a couple of ways. First of all, it'll allow even distribution of heat across the cheese vat. Obviously, the vat is being heated from the outside, so if you don't stir what's inside, you'll have very poor transfer of heat. So it facilitates cooking. It also stops the curd pieces from fusing back together. I might have told you, or if you've watched the dairy chemistry video, you'll have heard me probably say that the caseins have very, very strong self-association properties. So what happens is, I often describe caseins as the party proteins. They really like clustering together. So when you cut a casein gel, if you don't keep pieces moving, basically that gel wants to reform. Right? The caseins will interact with each other again and form clumps. So you want to stop the curd pieces from fusing. Stirring also helps Syneresis by very, very gentle collisions. The curd pieces are being mixed around, they kind of bump into each other very gently. That kind of squeezes them just a little bit and helps Syneresis. And they'll also bump up against the vat wall in the same way, again helping Syneresis. So when you cut the curds, as I said initially, there's you might need 5 or 10 minutes as a healing time. So just cut it and just leave it sit, just to heal. And then you will gently start stirring, again stirring gently, and that's to avoid a problem called curd shattering, where basically the curd pieces, small little tiny pieces of curd break off. They're called curd fines, and they'll be lost in the whey. Remember, you're separating the curds in the whey usually using some form of perforated screen. So if you've curd fines, they go into the whey, I think the big factories would have various forms of clarifiers to recover those curd fines and add them back in. But there's always a risk of getting a reduction in cheese yield. And many times I have told you that if I could improve cheddar cheese yields by a fraction of 1%, I'd be on my yacht in the Caribbean right now. So it's the one thing that really excites, particularly the cheddar industry, is anything to improve cheese yield. Okay, so it depends on the variety. Cheddar is a little bit unusual, as you might have guessed at this stage, in that it is, a lot of the main steps in cheddar manufacture are determined by pH values. A lot of other varieties, pH, you might follow it, but it's less critical. But the critical points in the case of cheddar are determined by pH. So in the case of cheddar, you'd stir and cook to maybe about pH 6.1, 6.2, something like that, and then drain the whey. Other varieties like Emmental, you will just cook it to a defined temperature and then drain the whey. Okay, and so it just depends. Then just to mention there of dry stirring, what that basically, it's a technology, it's not terribly commonly used. I often associate it with the US, like stirred curd cheddar and Colby, Monterey Jack as well, I think is another cheese they make over there with dry stirring. What they do there basically is drain the whey, leave the curds at the bottom of the vat, and then stir the curds around after whey drainage. And that obviously helps Syneresis quite significantly. So a couple of other last processing variables that affect Syneresis. Salting. Salting is a huge effect of Syneresis. If you add about 1 kilogram of salt into the cheese, you get about 2 kilograms of water out. I'll do that with you hopefully today. If not, I'll do it on the recording. But you should never vary the salt content to control moisture. And the reason for that, I hope, will be fairly clear for you when I give you a big long list of the effects that salt has on cheese quality. Okay, so you really don't want to vary salt just to get the moisture right, because you'll lot of other problems. Other factors like severely heat-treated milk, that's like over-pasteurized milk, something like that, obviously quite negative. A lot of these factors you might, again, that's another factor we've come across several times before. We came across it in renal coagulation time, came across it in gel strength, now we're coming across it in Syneresis. It's just underlying the fact that, again, Syneresis is effectively the last stage in the renal coagulation process in many ways. So severely heat-treated milk will give you poor renal coagulation times. It'll give you a weak gel, and will give you poor Syneresis. Okay. Again, remember, Syneresis is the caseins coming together. If those caseins are become effectively coated with denatured beta-lactoglobulin, then you're into problems. Homogenization will reduce Syneresis. Again, homogenization is almost never used for cheese milk. But I gave you a couple of examples where it might occasionally be used. One of them is in low-fat cheese. And in low-fat cheese, actually, you're trying to avoid Syneresis. You want to keep more moisture in the curd to give you a softer cheese. So that's one use of homogenization. Then various enzymes. Most proteolytic enzymes will give you poor Syneresis, like enzymes from cytotrophic bacteria, like Pseudomonas fluorescens in particular, or indeed the indigenous milk enzyme plasmin. Indigenous milk enzyme, you need to look at that dairy chemistry. How many of you looked at it? Many of you have. Okay, please, those of you who didn't put up your finger there, do it. Plasmin is the indigenous proteinase in milk. And what's happening there basically is the gel network. It's obviously a protein network. If you have enzymes that are cutting that, it weakens the gel network, it won't be able to come together as efficiently. Hence, you have poor Syneresis. Okay. Rennet helps Syneresis a little bit, but you get other problems like such as bitterness in the cheese if you have too much coagulant present. So, mechanism of Syneresis. I suppose basically the real message there is it's a continuation of the gel assembly process. Right? So as you said, it's almost the next stage in renal coagulation, a continuation of the gel assembly process. how it's done is by basically typical protein-protein interactions. If you're into protein chemistry, ionic interactions are positive and negative charge interactions, interactions, hydrogen bonds. The epsilon amino group of lysine, which is positively charged, is implicated. Then you have hydrophobic interactions and more ionic interactions. These are very typical protein-protein interactions. That's pulling it together. People have studied the kinetics of syneresis coming through. Initially, it's a first-order reaction, and that the rate of the reaction is proportional to the amount of whey that is left in the system. After you remove about 70% of the volume of whey, then the proportionality breaks down a little bit. So, really what that's saying is that initially you have an almost straight line relationship between the volume of whey and time, and then it breaks down a little bit later on. Okay, so I'm not going to go into any great detail the kinetics of syneresis, but people who are interested in mathematical modelling and such matters have done these things. Wouldn't like my fire though, shall we say. Okay, so that's a bit on syneresis. I think that's the end of that stack of slides. Might just rapidly move on to the next one, and just some final processing operations, such as cheddaring operation, the pasta filata step in mozzarella type cheese. So where we are here, we're kind of down again, still in dehydration, we're into cheddaring and the pasta filata step. What happens, how you separate the curds from the whey, inevitably is using some sort of a perforated screen, nearly always. Dutch type cheeses like Edam and Gouda have a washing step, and that's what's actually happening down here, where you reduce down the whey by about 1/3 and replace it by hot water. So it will cook the curd and also will reduce the lactose concentration a little bit. So you end up controlling the pH. Gouda type cheese with pH slightly higher than cheddar, maybe up around 5.4, whereas cheddar might be about 5.2. Then the curds are put into some sort of a mould to give it a size and a shape. Sometimes the mould is just pretty, or because of tradition. Other times there's a good reason for the size and the shape of the cheese, and I think I've slide in that at some stage, making that point a little bit more. Some cheeses in particular ripen from the outside inwards. So, for example, camembert cheese, a white mold cheese, the mold growing at the surface, as we'll see when I come back to you, has a big effect on how the cheese ripens. There's nothing to stop you from making a camembert cheese that size. But if you did, what would happen is that the outside of the cheese would be too ripe and the inside wouldn't be ripe enough. So that's why camembert, for example, is always a relatively small little cylinder of cheese about that sort of a size. Brie is a bit more, but it's thinner. Right, if you're familiar with it. You all doing your homework? You're doing your homework? Okay, make sure you do your homework. Seriously, guys, particularly before I come back to you for the ripening section, it would be very nice if you had at least a sense of the flavour of many of these cheeses as time goes on. So you might press the cheese, you salt it, and then there's the pasta filata step in the case of mozzarella type cheese. So how you drain the whey is through a perforated screen. You really want to avoid yield losses. This is the old cheese vats we used to have in the pilot plant in the years gone by. Vivek, who did a PhD with me many years ago, he's pumping up the whey, and at the end of the pipe there's a screen. It looks like a cylinder there at the end, but that's what is separating the curds from the whey. In the case of cheddar, you drain the whey at a desired pH, maybe 6.1, something like that. In the case of Emmental, it's acidifying temperature. Once you've reached max scald, that's the highest temperature that you're going to reach during cooking. And the pH at whey drainage is quite important for the texture of the cheese. Right? I don't have a slide in that, so I'll just make a little sketch. The pH at whey drainage is quite important for the amount of calcium that's retained in the curd. Okay, so if you have your casein micelle, you'll know the colloidal calcium phosphate is the salt associated with casein micelle, and they are in equilibrium, basically between soluble calcium and phosphate. Okay, and what happens when you, as the pH goes down, right, is that you get a migration of colloidal calcium phosphate, you get solubilization of colloidal calcium phosphate, so it moves from the caseins in the gel into what will become the whey. And depending on what pH you separate the curds and the whey, you effectively separate these two phases. The colloidal salts will go into the cheese, and the ones in the whey will be lost in the whey. So if you drain the whey at quite a low pH, you get a lot of colloidal calcium phosphate is dissolved, relatively little calcium, relatively speaking, in the curd, calcium in the curd, and all else being equal, that will mean that the cheese has quite a crumbly texture. Conversely, if you separate the curds and whey at a high pH, you have more calcium in the curd, and you get a more rubbery texture, more elastic texture. Lovely example of that is Emmental cheese. You're separating the curds and whey in Emmental are actually quite a high pH, because in Syneresis there's very little acidification before the cheese is moulded, and that then gives you a much more elastic curd, which is very good for Emmental. What you all know is Emmental cheese. It's this cheese. The eyes, they're not called holes, they're eyes in the cheese. Don't ask me why. An Emmental cheese without eyes is actually very politically incorrect. It's called a blind cheese. Would you believe it? But those holes are produced, or those eyes are produced by gas that's produced during ripening. And that rubbery and elastic texture helps the cheese trap the gas very, very, very effectively. Okay? So, as I said, pH of whey drainage is actually quite important then for the texture of the cheese between different varieties. So, pressing the curds under the whey is quite common in a lot of cheeses, mainly Dutch type cheeses. I'm sure there's other ones as well. That's an example of a pre-press vat. I took in a cheese factory. I'm going to say in Moravia in the Czech Republic. I could be wrong, but I think that's where it was. What was happening there, the main cheese vats were somewhere else. Okay, the curds and whey mixture is piped in through that. Where does it go in? I'd imagine it's in through that kind of greeny pipe. The pre-press vat here, the sides of the vat have perforations. So there's an outer wall here, so the whey can go through, and then eventually this plate then is put down to press the curds under the whey, and you get a very, very close textured cheese that way, with a very uniform texture to the cheese. So that happens, for example, in Dutch type cheeses. In this part of the cheese making process as well is where we get cheddaring. The traditional, I think I showed you pictures of the traditional method for cheddaring. That's a very much younger Dave Waldron there, who obviously doesn't have back problems, going into turning the blocks of curds during the cheddaring process. It was very, very manual work in the beginning. They used to do it they used to have special cheddaring tables that were relatively low, so it was a little bit better for the poor people's back at that time. And indeed, early attempts at automating cheddaring, they tried to mimic this turning and piling, like boxes and gimbals that turned around and all sorts of crazy things. But luckily, science came to the rescue, and they found out, probably guessing on the middle part of the last century, that the function of cheddaring really was to keep the curd uniformly warm to allow acid development. It's really to allow time for acid development. And once people discover that, then they were to cheddar it in very different ways than the traditional way, but obviously a lot more easier on the back. So you remember, again, if you look back in one of the earlier set of slides I had, I showed you a few different stages of cheddaring. When you drain the whey first, the little curd pieces are about the size of a grain of corn. Eventually you can put your hand into the bed and it just all falls apart. But eventually the casings, they interact with each other and they begin to stick together. And eventually they become kind of enough coherence that you can actually cut the bed into blocks. And then over time you turn those blocks and you pile them on top of each other. The main function of the turning, by the way, that Dave is doing there, is to keep the blocks uniformly warm. Okay? The bottom, obviously, the bottom and sides of the cheese vat are being heated, maybe around, pick a number there, maybe about 36 degrees. The surface of the cheese cloth is exposed to the air, which is considerably cooler. So to get uniform keep them uniformly warm, and thus uniform drop in pH, it's quite important that you keep them turned. At the end of cheddaring, you get a lot of physical chemical changes, as we'll see in a few seconds, during the cheddaring operation. And at the end of it, the texture of the curds is often like to that of cooked chicken breast meat. So it's not quite as tough and fibrous as chicken, but it's going in that direction. It's kind of almost like quite a tough and almost fibrous type texture. So what's actually happening during cheddaring? Well, as I said, the only real function of cheddaring is to allow time for uniform acid development. So there is the piling of the curd, and it actually, the blocks actually begin to flow outwards as well. Again, that's one not of any huge significance. But what happens is basically you get fermentation of lactose to lactic acid. So pick a number at the point of whey separation, the curds might be as pH 6.1, 6.2. By the time you're at the end of the cheddaring operation, before you go milling, I'd probably say more, I don't know where I got this slide from, but I'd probably say more about 5.4 would be a more common pH to mill the curds at. And basically what happens during that time is that as the pH comes down, you get solubilization of colloidal calcium phosphate. So calcium phosphate that's associated with caseins, it's going in basically into the water that's inside in the curd. Right? So when most of the whey has been lost at this stage, there's a little bit left, and it's going into that in the water that's left in the curd. So you get solubilization of micellar calcium phosphate. You get an increase of the ratio of soluble to micellar calcium. So you get basically this equilibrium goes, you get an increase in the amount of soluble calcium, a decrease in the amount of casein-bound calcium. You get an increase in the hydration of the caseins, the amount of water that's bound to the caseins. That will all be seen as kind of flow of the paracasein matrix, and that's really what's happening during the cheddaring process. Okay, so all of that piling and repiling and backbreaking work that I showed you there can be automated in quite a different fashion. And this is the best photograph I could think of. The early attempts at automating cheddaring, in fact, they're still used to a certain extent, are using cheddaring towers, like the Cheddar Master Tower. These are the big one up in the old plant in Mitchelstown up in the old days, but it's gone for scrap for many years. What happens there basically is that the curds and whey mixture are separated on the belt. So the curds and whey mixture out there, the whey drains through. The curds then are transported pneumatically to the top of a very tall tower. And basically it's just, again, it fills up with curd, and basically a piece of curd takes so many hours to go through the tower, and it goes in at maybe pH 6.1, and then at the end of when it comes out to the bottom of the tower, it's at pH 5.4. It's then milled, cut into small pieces, then you have a salting belt, and then it can go off to be pressed using a block form. Okay. Now, those Cheddar Master towers, I have seen they're still around, but they're not as common as they might have been once upon a time. Nowadays, the alpha-matic continuous cheddaring systems are, I won't say universal, but they're moving in that direction in the cheddar industry. And basically what happens here is it's basically a series of belts, perforated belts. The first belt, you do most of the drainage of the whey. And then basically the curd just moves at a really, really slow pace across the other belts. So it goes in at pH 6.1. And by the time it comes to the end of the middle belt there, it's at 5.4. It's milled, and then the bottom belt then is for salting, and then the salted curds move on for pressing. So there's a few more pictures on that. Again, that's just a close-up of the same diagram. The first belt there, number 4 on the belt there, is where most of the whey is separated. There's little amounts of whey coming out right the way through the process, so all of the belts are perforated, but just most of the whey comes out initially. And then the curd just moves really, really, really slowly around the system across the belts until it gets to the end by position number 5 on that diagram there. At that stage, it's about pH 5.4. It's milled, cut into small pieces. Then dry salt is added. That's what's indicated as number 7 there. And then you have devices like in fingers to mix in the salt on the last salting belt, or something's called the mellowing belt at the end. So just a few more pictures of these. These are very big things. That's an old alpha-matic. It's not a very big one. Took that picture many, many years ago. But just to give you some sense of it, just have a look at the walkway there. You know, you can see, you get some sense of it. It's the size of a house, basically. And some of these things can be absolutely huge, these alpha-matic systems. So that's a commercial photograph there. Gold gave me a number of years ago. It's just looking in along the length of the alpha-matic. Just give you some figures there. It takes maybe 40-45 minutes on that belt. And you'd have about maybe 9.5 tons of cheese very, very, very slowly moving towards you in that picture. And then it kind of falls over the edge, almost like a waterfall of cheese curd. It's then milled and then salted as time goes on. So there's just pictures of curds being dry salted. The dry salt is mixed in, and then the curds are tumbled on top of each other to distribute the salt at the end of the alpha-matic process. That's an older system where the dry salt has been sprayed out of that pipe there. You see it looks like a rake there is a depth sensor. It measures the depth of the curd bed, and that will then control the amount of salt that's added in. And then you see these fingers then rotate around quite slowly, and they help to mix in the salt with the curds. So there's also a casomatic system. It's another way for a continuous system for whey drainage, pre-pressing, block formation, and so on. But I saw one of those, not that picture, no, I stole that one off the internet, but I would have come across that in O'Killy, in their mass dammer plant in Mobili in East Cork. That could make quite a lot of what they call continental type cheeses. Mass dam, and they're also in a joint venture with the Norwegian firm Tina for making Tina make a Jarlsberg, which is kind of a hybrid between both Mass Dammer and Jarlsberg. They're kind of hybrids between, I suppose the best way of summarising them is kind of hybrid Swiss Gouda type cheeses, and they have a casomatic down there. So pasta filata cheese. Those of you doing the masters, you all have been. Those of you doing the masters know you owe me an essay, is that right? Have you all looked at the video I did on that? If you have any questions, email me. Whichever one of you are doing masters. Usually they sit at the functions at the back, but I've quite figured that out. So the pattern I've noticed over many, many decades at this stage. So I don't know why it always happens. That's why I assume you guys in front of me are kind of more likely to be masters, and those at the back are more likely to be in fourth year. Those of you doing, as I said, that's the master's flavour of this module, FS6120. You owe me an essay on industrial manufacture of pasta filata cheeses like mozzarella. Those of you at the back, if you're doing FS4020 or 4620, you don't need to worry about it at all. Okay, so just have to make the module a little bit more challenging for the masters. So I gave you some fairly clear instructions on that essay. The most important thing is I'm not looking for an essay on just simply how you make mozzarella cheese. It's a lot on industrial manufacture, what technology is used, so keep that word in your mind. Now, in the case of mozzarella, which is the type of cheese you all know and love from your pizza, mozzarella was a relatively minor southern Italian variety, traditionally made from buffalo milk, until probably about after the Second World War, when the world discovered pizza, and then it became a very, very important cheese. Probably the second most important cheese that's made worldwide at this stage. And the key step is that after acidification, after the curds are acidified, before they're salted, they are traditionally it was done by hand. They're kneaded for a very short period of time in very hot water, and that causes a lot of important physical chemical changes to the curd. The curd has to be acidified down maybe about 5.2. If it's above 5.4, you get very poor plasticization of the curd. What happens during that kneading step is that the casein fibers will align. You'll also get elongated pools of fat. So instead of roughly spherical fat globules in cheese, they get these kind of pools of fat. You also get some free fat being formed, which allows lubrication of casein sheets. They can kind of slide over each other more easily. So there is that. And then when you have extension and shear stresses, aids in the displacement of contiguous planes of paracasein matrix. In other words, basically you get that very nice melting properties. So it stretches very well when it's molten. A little experiment we used to do with the classes in the old days, and you might even want to do it at home sometime as part of your homework, is take a paper plate or something like that, put a small little pile of grated cheddar on one side and a small little pile of grated mozzarella on the other side, and put it into a microwave for a few seconds until it melts. And what you'll find is that mozzarella cheese will melt very uniformly, and you put a fork into it, you get these lovely strings and when you stretch it, okay, when you pull it up, like here. On the other hand, cheddar will also melt, but you'll see quite a lot of free oil coming out from the melted cheddar. It's not very nice for a pizza, as you can imagine. And also when you put a fork into it, you will get some strings, but they break very easily. So those very good functional properties, or very appropriate functional properties of mozzarella are related to the pasta filata step that happens. So again, traditionally it was done by hand. A picture of that coming up in a while. But basically it was kneading the acidified curds in quite hot water. So the hot water, now the curd never quite reaches the water temperature because the process is quite fast. So you've got time to reach the same temperature as the water. And you have to do it on acidified curds. In fact, it's relatively easy to modify a cheddar plant to make mozzarella, because you can use the same cheese vats, the same alphamatic, same everything. The only thing you need is a cooker stretcher. So Dave and I went to a little fact-finding mission on your behalf down to Carberry during the summer, and they actually do that. They make cheddar and mozzarella on the same line. Just in the case of mozzarella, they just divert the curd and they'll put it through a cooker stretcher. Now, you will need different starter cultures and different times and temperatures and those sorts of things, but it's relatively straightforward to modify a cheddar plant to produce mozzarella. Okay, so you get a lot of these physical chemical changes. You also get quite a lot of inactivation of rennet activity, which also will actually help in the functional properties of the cheese as well. Okay. So just a few pretty pictures. That's the mozzarella plant I looked at probably on the time you're all nappies. This is very old. The 2005, that's basically the mozzarella curds at the end of acidification. So it's effectively has been checkered, if you want a better term. And then it goes in. This is just a picture I took from a book, just showing the traditional way. Did Dave do that with some of those who did the practicals? He showed you an example of that. You kind of need Teflon hands to do it, because even the water is really, really hot. But you see the cheese almost becomes like a plastic mass at the end of it. Okay, so then just you get a fibrous meat-like texture. It's essential for good stretchability of mozzarella. That's again the pictures I took in this. A very small mozzarella plant and a slightly larger one in Italy a number of years ago. This is a nice one here. Is that arm was kind of moving around and kneading the curds in the very hot water, so you get a sense of it, almost like a plastic mass at the end of kneading. Okay, and just some pictures there. Global production volume, about 6 million tons of mozzarella, growing, as you'd imagine. And you can see there, it's I can't remember. I updated these slides relatively recently so that they're not terribly old data. You can see there around maybe 22% of world cheese production is mozzarella, so it's a very, very major cheese variety. Okay. In this case, again, in Turin, the mozzarella plant, the curds go into the cooker stretcher, and this is almost like the molten melted cheese coming out from the cooker stretcher. Okay. So again, and if you look at those of you doing the essay, also have a look at the early couple of slides I had. Remember, I gave you just probably my first lecture with you. I went through just pictures of cheddar plants and the mozzarella plants as well. So I gave you some pictures there. Okay. So anyway, moving rapidly along, just 2 more stacks of slides. With any luck, we'll get through most of them before we run out of steam. That's the first slide I have there. It must be molding and pressing of cheese. Coming towards the end of the process at this stage. So we're molding and salting. Some cheeses are molded first and then salted. But a lot of cheeses are done that way because most cheeses are brine salted, so you press them into their shape and then put them into the brine. Cheddar is a bit different in that you mill the curd, you salt it, and then you press it in the mold after salting. So just bear that one in mind. How should I say, the size and the shape of the cheese are characteristic of the variety. You know, cheddar traditionally would have been pressed into a wheel. Like a cylinder of cheese. That's not really done anymore, except maybe in farmhouse cheese manufacture. Cheddar is nowadays in a 20 kilogram block, nearly always. When you mold, depends on the cheese a little bit. In the case of cheddar, it's after acidification, after milling, after salting, then you mold it together. Other cheeses, it's molded much earlier on, like Emmental, it's after cooking. In fact, a lot of cheeses, they actually pitch the curds and whey into the mold, and the whey goes out through the holes in the side, and the curds is trapped inside. And that's fairly common for something like Emmental and in many other cheeses as well. A lot of cheeses are pressed. High moisture cheeses don't really need to press them because the curds will actually knit together and form a cheese without any need for pressure. Low moisture cheeses, though, you do need to press the curds. Okay, so a couple of things. If you're ready to press the cheese, the curd must be quite warm. Otherwise, you get mechanical openings. You can see these kind of openings at the surface of this block of cheese there. They're just where you have pieces of curd that are incompletely fused together, so you have a gap between them. And the mechanical openings are a defect in most varieties. They're a defect in most varieties. The only real exception to that is probably something like blue cheese, where they're essential. That's where the mold actually grows. They grow in mechanical openings, and I have that on the recordings so you can have a look at in your own time. Okay, but if the curd is too cool when you press it together, basically it doesn't fuse together properly, and you get lots of mechanical openings. Mechanical openings tend to kind of close up over time, particularly if the cheese is vacuum sealed. You get it coming together quite well. So, how do you press the curds? Well, in a nutshell, there are traditional, good old-fashioned presses like that. Again, some ones from various books. That's the one that I think was there when I was an undergraduate. It's pretty ancient. That's a pneumatic press that we use in the pilot plant. Those simple presses are really only used in farmhouse scale manufacture at this stage. In industry, they use block formers, or to be more precise, wind canton towers. Everyone refers to them as a block former, but they're continuous pressing methods. And as I said, food industry always likes continuous operations, doesn't like batch operations. They're much less efficient. So how these wind canton towers, or these block formers work? Right, they're very, very tall towers, maybe 5-6 meters tall, something like that, and quite narrow. The salted curd, in the case of cheddar, is conveyed pneumatically into the tower, and the tower is filled up with salted curd. And basically, what happens is that the cheese curd at the bottom of that tower is being pressed by 5 or 6 meters of cheese above it. So it's under significant pressure. It's helped as well as a slight vacuum that's pulled that will help it to knit together again. And so you have this column of curd. The bottom of the curd is being pressed. You have a blade that comes across, a knife that comes across, that will cut off the bottom of the curd, a pneumatic ram that pushes that block into a plastic bag, and then the blade will come back, the column falls down, and then every maybe few, 30 seconds, a minute or something, you cut off the bottom of the curd and you get another block. So it goes into a bag at that stage. So a ram then, a pneumatic ram or your hydraulic ram pushes the block of cheese into a bag. Okay, so there are just inevitably multiple of these. You might have 8 or 10 of these block formers in a cheddar factory. This is an older factory. In fact, this is long gone now at this stage. It's an older one. In this case, you have an operator putting the bag at the outlet of the column. You only see the bottom of the columns there. You have a metal detector, that's that arch over there on the left as well. More modern plants, the operators are replaced by a computer basically and technology. This is the Dairygo plant, there are 9 of them, of these block formers. And they have automatic devices at the bottom to put the bags on the, so basically then the block of cheese comes out. And it goes through a vacuum sealer. This device here that's closest to us is for vacuum sealing the cheese curds. Okay, so here's just a few blocks of cheese for 20 kilogram blocks of cheddar cheese going into the vacuum sealer. So you can see that you have quite a lot of openings in the cheese at this stage. Obviously, when cheese is vacuum sealed, that will help to close them down, and over time they generally tend to close down a little bit more. Okay, so again, just another picture at this stage, the various 20 kilogram blocks of cheese. You can see there, they're going through the metal detector, that arch on the right-hand side of this photograph. In the back there, they actually have 2 vacuum sealers, one on the left and one just out of the photograph there on the right. And there's full traceability. Each block of cheese is given this unique barcode that will trace it right the way back to each individual vat that it came from and the day of manufacture and all those sorts of things. So full traceability towards the system. So just a comment on cheese size and shape. Quite often the size and shape of a cheese is not cosmetic. In other words, it's not just done because it's pretty. There's oftentimes there's a reason for it. For example, surface ripened cheeses, surface mold ripened cheeses, bacterial smear ripened cheeses. Again, look at the video on different types of cheeses to explain those. They tend to be small cylinders of cheese, maybe kind of 6 inches in diameter, that sort of size. And the reason for that is that they ripen from the surface towards the centre. So there's nothing to stop you from making a camembert cheese that size, but what would happen is that the outside of the cheese will become overripe and the inside will become not ripe at all. And then you're left in trouble. Okay? All goes back to surface area to volume ratio, quite an important parameter in lots of areas actually in biology. Okay. Conversely, things like an Emmental cheese. An Emmental cheese is a big cheese. Well, 80 kilogram traditional wheel of Emmental is that sort of size. So it's a big cheese, and it has to be big because defining characteristic of Emmental cheese are these eyes, and likewise you need to form an eye in cheese, you actually have to develop quite a high pressure of carbon dioxide to push the curd apart to form the eye, basically the bubble in the cheese. Now, if you made a small Emmental cheese, again, you could make an Emmental cheese the size of a camembert, what would happen is that the surface area to volume ratio would be too high, and you'd lose gas from the surface of the cheese, and you'd never develop enough pressure within the cheese to force the curd apart. To force the eye development. Okay. So in other words, basically, quite often the size and shape, there's a reason for the size and the shape of the cheese. Not always. Sometimes it is just because they look pretty, but sometimes there's a reason for it. So, as I said, let's just picture there Emmental cheese. You see a full wheel, it's the traditional Swiss Emmental. It has to be a large cheese to attain sufficient partial pressure of carbon dioxide to develop the eyes, basically push the curd apart to develop the eye. Camembert, on the other hand, must be a small wheel because it ripens from the surface in towards the center. Okay? And that's just another picture. I'll put that in there, I'm not really sure, for soft cheeses drink. Okay, making good progress. We'll be finished hopefully on time unless things go really bad. Just one last stack of slides, and this one is on salting. Pretty much all cheeses are salted at the end of manufacture. handful of very unusual ones that would be not salted, but usually acid coagulated cheeses. Well, any rennet coagulated cheeses, nearly all of them are salted. And the amount of salt that's added varies quite significantly. Emmental cheese has probably the lowest level of salt, at about maybe about 0.7% salt as a percent salt in the cheese. Highest levels of salt would be in cheeses that are ripened under brine, like Greek feta type cheese. And again, if you're not familiar with these cheeses, have a look at those little videos that I did on the system for you. The salt in moisture content is usually quotable rather than the percentage salt in cheese. And the reason for that is that what's important, if you're a bacterium inside the cheese, it doesn't really matter what the average is, it's what is the concentration of salt in the liquid that's surrounding that bacterium. That's salt in moisture. So salt is a percentage of the water that's in cheese. That's quite significant. So salt has, as we'll see, we'll go around the wheel here again, a lot of effects of salt on cheese. Lots of them affects microbial growth, affects enzyme activity, affects water activity, composition, obviously affects flavour in the cheese as well. And so we just go around that wheel there. First of all, it controls microbial growth. Starter organisms will basically keep producing acid until they basically poison themselves with their own lactic acid. But for most starters, you wouldn't get to that point until you're well below the pH that's naturally found in cheese, that you want in cheese. So you could be down at pH 4.6, 4.2 for lactococcus, something like that. To stop the growth of the starter, salt is what stops the growth of the starter. Okay? It also has a big effect on, in Swiss type cheese, the secondary starter is used. And again, please look at those little videos before I see you again. And there's an organism called Propionibacterium freudenreichii. That is what produces the gas in Swiss type cheese. And that organism is very sensitive to salt. And that's why Emmental type cheeses have the lowest level of salt of any cheese varieties. Okay? And it also, salt in, say, something like cheddar will determine the amount of residual lactose in the curd. And what happens is if you have a low level of salt and moisture, for example, 4.1 here, you see lactose disappears very quickly in the cheese curd. It goes down to zero within, whatever that is, maybe 2 weeks. And that's what you want. You do not want a fermentable carbohydrate present in your cheese. Right? It's only asking for problems during ripening. On the other hand, a high salt and moisture, which is 6.3% here, the square boxes on this plot here, you can see that you still have a significant amount of lactose persisting into ripening. And that is a recipe for problems in cheese. So it's actually quite important that you don't over-salt the cheese, because you get a lot of lactose persisting into the cheese, and that will cause a lot of problems. It controls microbial growth, as I said. The final pH of cheese is determined by salt, and so it's the buffering capacity of the cheese as well. In cheddar type cheese, if you have an increase in salt and moisture, SM, salt and moisture, that will lead to an increase in lactose concentration, which will give you a reduction in the average quality of the cheese. And that's what's shown in this upper graph here, where you look at it's showing basically salt and moisture in the open circles down below, and then the grade score of the cheese in the upper graph in black. And you can see at the higher salt and moisture, you generally speaking have lower grade in the cheese, so and poorer quality of the cheese. The reason for that is that lactose is obviously a fermentable carbohydrate. If that goes into the cheese, you get growth of undesirable microorganisms during ripening that might give you various problems in the cheese. So in cheddar, high salt moisture, high lactose, low quality. So that's what is there. And again, this is just another making the same point. You have salt and moisture content on the x-axis and lactose on the y-axis. And you can see basically the high salt moisture, you have generally higher levels of lactose, which is a recipe for problems in cheese GUI. Most cheeses are not dry salted like cheddar. They're brine salted. So I'll go through the technology on this at the end of it. This thing that looks like a very large, strange swimming pool here is actually a brine bath. And believe me, some of them are not the same size. They're not Olympic-sized swimming pools, but you can think of a swimming pool in a big hotel, that sort of size. Wouldn't recommend you go for a dip in them, though. The attainment of equilibrium in a brine salted cheese takes a long time. Okay? But what happens is in brine salting is you press the cheese into its final shape and dip it into brine for maybe a couple of days, maybe shorter. But then it takes a long time for the salt to diffuse inwards into the cheese. That's some old data there from, it's actually Immobilia Regato cheese, which is a cheese about that size. It's not very big, whatever size that is, that sort of size. It's not a terribly big, if you look at me in the recording, that sort of size. It's not a terribly big cheese by any means. But if you look there, what happens is at day one, the center of the cheese is here, the sides of the cheese is over here. You can see at day one, you have very high salt concentrations in the outside, as you'd expect, and very low in the center. And in that little cheese there, it took 83 days to effectively come to equilibrium, that size of cheese. Another example is Parmigiano Reggiano, which is a hard Italian granite cheese, and that's quite a big cheese, that sort of size. That can take about 10 months to come to salt equilibrium. So it's very slow in brine salted cheeses. Conversely, attaining equilibrium in dry salted cheeses is very fast. It all goes back to surface area to volume ratio. Remember, when you cut cheddar into small little chips and then add the salt, you get a very rapid uptake in salt in cheddar cheese. But you get very poor transfer of salt between two curd chips. Very poor transfer of salt across a chip boundary. Right? I think that's what comes up in the next slide. It is indeed just some work that was done a number of years ago, where basically they took, the bottom part of the cheese was salted, and then they had unsalted cheese or curd above it, and they looked at how quickly the salt migrated from the salted curd below into the unsalted curd above. And to cut a very long story short, you can look through that graph at your own time. But basically, there was a quite poor transfer of salt across chip boundaries. It takes quite a, so the significance of that in practice actually is that you really need to get uniform distribution of the salt in the dry salted cheese like cheddar. You can't, if you don't have good mixing of the curd, it won't come to equilibrium after pressing. So, influences enzyme activity. Salt is one factor that can affect enzyme activity. Usually the direct effect of salt is relatively small. Okay, there's some figures there on chymosin and plasmin. So usually its direct effect is probably relatively minor. But it has a major indirect effect on enzyme activity, particularly chymosin activity on beta-casein. And I think the next couple of slides will show that. Chymosin cuts beta-casein towards the end of the molecule, right? Particularly this last bond here, is leucine 192, tyrosine 193, that bond there at the end. And the rate of cleavage of that bond is very much dependent on the ionic strength of the system, which in turn is basically related to the salt concentration. So salt then has a big effect on how quickly that leucine 192, tyrosine 193 bond is cut by chymosin. Right? It's a bond that's very susceptible to chymosin action. Why am I worrying about this? I hear you ask. Well, if the short peptide that's produced when you cut that bond, it's from tyrosine along to the end of the protein there, it's from 193 to 209, so it's fragment 193 to 209. That is a very hydrophobic and extremely bitter peptide. So basically, cut a long story short, salt affects the cleavage of that bond. If you have sufficient salt in the system, you get very low cleavage of that bond. It's probably due to the beta-casein protein interacting with other beta-casein proteins hydrophobically. If your salt concentration is too low, then you get a lot of that bitter peptide, beta-casein fragment 193 to 209. So it has surprised a lot of, okay, not regularly now, but I have had phone calls from industry asking, that their customers are complaining of bitterness in cheese. And they're often surprised that the first question I ask them is not about bitterness, it's what is the salt content of the cheese. So almost certainly, if you have bitterness in cheese, it's probably because the salt content is too low, and you then get the cleavage of that bond in beta-casein. Okay? And that's just gel electrophoresis. This is in the laboratory. This is beta-casein hydrolyzed by chymosin at different ionic strengths. In pure water, it's completely broken down. At 1.5 molar salt, it's completely intact. So the rate of cleavage of that bond is very determined on the ionic strength of cheese, which in turn is determined by the salt content of the cheese. So cheddar cheeses made with different salt concentrations. This is a very old study we did many, many years back. They control cheddar cheese here with the normal salt. The bitter peptide, you can hardly see it. You see the peptide there with the star on top of it. It looks like a circle in that diagram now, which is there. That's 193 to 209. That cheese was not really salted at all. As you increase the salt concentration, the concentration of that peptide effectively disappeared. And so that's the take-home message. So basically, the take-home message is if the cheese is bitter, the first question you ask really is what is its salt concentration? Very important thing. So that's an indirect effect of salt on enzyme activity. Salt regulates water activity. I'd mentioned Professor Roos has told you a lot about water activity down through the years, at least those of you sitting in the back rows. Those of you in front of you probably picked it up. That's one of the probably the most important parameter in food technology, really, after temperature. It's basically a measure of the availability of water. It's the ratio of the vapor pressure of water in the system divided by the vapor pressure of pure water at the same temperature. That's the definition of it there. It's a measure basically of the availability of water. And in cheese, it's affected very significantly by salt concentration. Okay? So you get these kind of nomographs where you have water percentage here, salt percentage there, and if you have 40% moisture, 2% salt, if you draw a line between there, wherever it cuts the center line there, will give you the water activity. So this is about 0.97 in that example that it gave you there. So very important. So water activities affects a whole pile of things and is largely determined by salt. Effect composition. About 2 kilograms of water are lost for every kilogram of salt that you add. At this stage, most of the whey has been lost a long time ago. A little bit of whey comes out during pressing. It's called press whey. Very difficult to do anything with it. It's usually just dumped because it has quite a high salt content, so you can't really process it. It's not that very easy to salt press it at all. So that's affecting composition. Affects flavor directly, obviously. Makes the cheese salty. It's kind of a savoury food. Has a direct effect. It also controls the activity of enzymes and microorganisms, controls bitterness, so all those things affect flavor. It also affects texture of the cheese, largely through its effect on moisture loss. So if you have, if it squeezes out more moisture, then you'll have more loss of that. Okay, it affects composition, affects proteolysis, the breakdown of the protein matrix as well. So just last thought on before we move on this one is just say a few words on cheddar cheese. Like cheddar, as you might guess at this stage, is a highly automated process. Basically cheddar is made by computer. And it's interesting, this was a little study that was done in Moore Park a number of years ago. And really what they found, a very simple study really, is just measure the pH and salt concentration of a lot of retail samples of cheddar cheese. And immediately you can see there's actually a very significant variation in salt concentration and indeed in pH. So, if I was able to develop a system that would very reliably control the pH and salt concentration of cheddar, again, probably wouldn't be in here and make a lot of money out of it. But in industry, they do as much as they can to control salt and pH. But in spite of that, there is actually quite a significant, surprisingly large variation in the salt and pH variation in commercial cheddar cheese. So I think this is that's another version, I think, of the bitterness and salt slide. I'm not really sure. It's the same one there, basically. I think it's the same point I made earlier. So methods of salting, just a few pictures towards the end on how you actually salt cheese. There's three basic methods. Most varieties are brine salted, which means the cheese is pressed into its final shape and then dipped into brine, salted water, for a short while. Dry salting, like cheddar, as I said, the curd is cut into small chips, both sides of my finger, and dry salt is added, and then it's pressed afterwards. And then there's a third one, which is occasionally used. I've seen it in blue cheese manufacturers, fairly common. I've seen it in pecorino type cheese in Italy as well, where they actually press the cheese into its final shape and then add dry salt to the surface of the cheese. The idea there is that the salt will kind of diffuse inwards, it will dissolve in the way at the surface and kind of diffuse inwards. And every couple of days you might repeat that process. Just surface application of dry salt to a previously molded cheese. So a few, I suppose, pictures of that and a few ideas on those. Brine salting, they look like small little, it could be any cheese, I really don't know what they are. The length of cheese, time it's in the brine bath depends on the size of the cheese. Obviously what's driving the salt in is osmosis. You're going from a high concentration of salt in the brine into a low concentration of salt in the cheese, so osmosis moving inwards. And it's an impeded diffusion process. What that means basically is that it's not a perfect diffusion because it's diffusing through a fairly dense protein network and also fat globules every now and again. So they act to impede the process, my apologies, on that one, to impede the diffusion of salt. Dry salting, on the other hand, what happens, the salt dissolves in the whey at the surface of the curd chip. So effectively, you actually get a kind of almost like a really concentrated brine layer at the surface, and then that diffuses inwards. So the dry salt dissolves in the whey at the surface of the chip, and then diffuses inwards quite quickly. So each little chip is almost like a little mini cheese almost. And you get a very rapid uptake in salt because of a very rapid surface area to volume ratio. So that's took that picture in a pecorino plant in Sardinia a few years back. It was a really nice trip to Sardinia, doing a version of this course I myself in the university over there. And what was happening there, that's the final cheese. And basically the dry salt is added at the surface. And a little bit will dissolve inwards. And usually that would be repeated many times to get sufficient salt in the cheese. So that's surface application of dry salt. So a little bit of science before we go too far on, and that's on factors affecting salt uptake in cheese. A few fairly general ones. First is the concentration gradient, particularly for brine salted cheeses. Now the difference in concentration between the brine in the brine bath and the cheese itself. Usually brine baths, by the way, use saturated brine, so saturated salt solution. The cheese geometry, the size and shape of the cheese. Initially the size, smaller cheeses will take up salt more rapidly than a big cheese. Again, surface area to volume ratio. If you have an equal surface area to volume ratio, what becomes important after that is the number of corners in the cheese. Because what happens if you have a corner in the cheese is basically salt can diffuse in two directions. Okay? You get better if for an equal surface area to volume ratio, you get better uptake from a rectangular cheese. Next best one would be a cylindrical cheese. And then if you have a spherical cheese, that would have the worst uptake for an equal surface area to volume ratio. Time. Obviously, time is important. Often they get roughly proportional to the square root of time. Temperature, even though, to be honest with you, cheeses are generally brined at refrigeration temperatures or close to it. But there is a minimum of salt uptake at about 32 degrees. And the reason for that is that the fat in the cheese can kind of melt at that temperature and form a film at the surface of the cheese, so you don't get salt going in, basically. Curd pH then as well, and moisture content of the curd. And I think that these will be up on the next couple of slides. So this spent a little time going through this particular slide. And then we'll be very fast after that. These are factors affecting salt uptake in brine salted cheeses and then dry salted cheeses. Slightly different list of factors. In the case of brine salted cheeses, obviously brine concentration is an obvious one. Even though in practice, as I said, it's nearly always saturated brine. The time it's in the brine, the temperature of the brine, you get an increase in temperature up to about 20 degrees. After that, you get a decrease because of the fat is liquefying and can form a film at the surface of the cheese that stops the salt going in. Surface area to volume ratio, obviously the smaller the cheese, the better surface area to volume ratio, and you get more rapid. The curvature, that was basically the shape of the cheese like I was talking to you a few minutes ago. Curd moisture, you get better salt uptake in a brine salted system if you have a high curd moisture in the system. A curd pH, you get the salt uptake decreases as pH goes from 4.7 to 5.7. So the higher the pH, the lower is the salt uptake. And then the salt and moisture of the curd before brining. Don't worry about that one. So that's the list for brine salted cheeses. For dry salted cheeses, on the other hand, I suppose the amount of salt that's added, it's an obvious one. The mixing time, that's often referred to as the mellowing time. The mellowing time. The more time you have there, basically before you press the curd, the better is the salt uptake. The holding time between the mixing time, the holding time, the curd temperature. Okay. Again, you'd be usually pressing, or you'd be doing it at a slightly higher temperature, and you'll decrease as the temperature goes up from 24 to 41 degrees. I presume that those figures were from one particular study, but what's happening there basically is that you increase the temperature, you get fat liquefaction, which can coat the curd chips, and thus you get poor salt can't go through the fat layer, basically. The curd chip size, the smaller the curd chips, the better is the salt uptake. Curd moisture is an interesting one, in that you actually get a decrease in salt uptake at a higher curd moisture. What happens there actually is that at a higher curd moisture, when you add salt, you get more syneresis. So you get more whey, more curdswhey, which can then wash away the salt. So you have less salt uptake. So say that again. The high curd moisture, you get more syneresis, more whey loss at that stage. And that whey can actually just wash away some of the salt, so it doesn't go into the cheese on pressing. And then curd acidity, you get a decrease in uptake as curd acidity decreases or pH increases. So high pH, you get poor salt uptake. Okay? So a few minor last points, and then we'll finish up. Brines are usually saturated, I said there. They often will contain calcium chloride. Because what happens flipping a fresh brine, a freshly prepared brine, if you put the cheese in terms of calcium, you have a high concentration of calcium in the cheese and low concentration of calcium in the brine. So you can leach out calcium ions from the cheese into the brine. Now, that's a particular problem in a freshly prepared brine. And, to cut a long story short, you can get the softening of the surface of the cheese, get the sticky softening of the surface of the cheese. So to make sure, particularly in eventually, by the way, you tend to reuse brines almost forever. Eventually, enough salt will have leached out from the cheese that a new cheese going in, it will be in equilibrium. But to get to that point, particularly in a fresh cheese, a fresh brine, you got calcium chloride. So diffusion depends on the moisture content of the cheese, fat content. Fat again acts as a kind of a barrier. Salt has to go around it, so fat generally impedes the salt uptake. Temperature, concentration gradient, cheese geometry, and time. We mentioned that before. So a few pictures of brining systems in cheese. There's, I suppose, three basic types. a very simple brine bath, where you just basically have the cheeses floating in a brine, and the brine might be recirculated slowly, and it might be cleaned and filtered and then recirculated around, so the cheeses are just sitting in the brine bath. You then have surface brining. In that case, what happens is the cheeses float on the surface of the brine, often through a kind of a labyrinth, so that basically the cheese is floating on, is making its way through, and then by the time it goes out, it has picked up enough salt. That's the brining. That's a simple brine bath. And that was from a very small factory actually in the south of Italy many years ago. You can just see they're basically just sitting in there. They're to keep them soak. I wouldn't recommend this by any means, but they obviously using a kind of sackcloth or something like that to kind of push the cheeses underneath the level of the brine. Don't do it. Okay. Surface brining, as I said, they float across the surface of the brine. So like camembert, very very similar. This is a variant of a surface brining system in that mozzarella plant, where this was before I had a very very early phone. It wasn't a smartphone, so I had a camera in it, and I did my best to take the picture. But I could never quite get the picture. They basically, the pieces of mozzarella about the size of my fist were coming out here, and then they would float along the length of that brine bath. Then at the ends, they'd have picked up enough salt. Deep brining systems then, basically, if I go back a couple of slides there, the deep brining system, what you do is you stack the cheeses on a rack and then put the rack into a very big brine bath, almost like a swimming pool. A few years ago in Sardinia, that's the brine bath. You can just see the tops of the racks protruding from the level of the brine where the cheeses are. Though if we go on to the next one, the cheeses are basically stacked on these racks, and then the entire rack is just dipped into the cheese vat. Okay, so as I said, attainment of equilibrium, I went through this with you a few minutes ago. Basically, it takes a long time in a brine salted cheese for cheese to come to equilibrium. One final slide, just one mention of smoking of cheese, smoked cheese. It's not tremendously common, but you will be able to find it. Basically, you hang the cheeses in a smoke cabinet. You get dehydration of the surface, obviously, because it's heat. Also, smoke will contain a lot of antimicrobial compounds, antifungal compounds, and obviously gives flavour to the cheese. So, just to mention that as well. So, as I said, that's kind of where, bang on time actually, I'm very proud of myself, organised where I should be. That's what we've done at the moment, is taking you to the end of cheese manufacture. Next, you might see me for a couple of weeks. Next week we'll have Professor Gerald Fitzgerald, and Gerald will go through starter systems with you and all those happy things. Then you have Alan Kelly, known to many of you. Alan will go through processed cheese and yogurts with you. And then when I come back to you, I have 2 more sessions right at the end of the module, and we'll go through the microbiology and biochemistry of cheese. Okay, so leave it at that, and I'll see you all the next week.